big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. If you need a website or a domain, go to squarespace.com/James and you'll get 10% off your first purchase. Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to Ireland, where I'm getting attacked by midges. Myself and Rich have moved on from the last video, which was a couple of days ago. We are now on the Ring of Kerry, well, just down there. And for some reason, when I was researching this trip a couple of weeks back, I came across this track on Google Street View. Don't really understand how, but I'm pleased I did, because it looks exactly like my kind of scene. We've got pylons, we've got a track, a really nice looking track that kind of winds its way down towards the coast, and then the islands in the background. Then there's a nice blanket of cloud over there and a setting sun just behind us. It's perfect, and my plan is to spend the next 5 minutes here trying to see if I get a photo. I think I should manage something. There's a van coming. Hiya. Good, thanks, how are you? Right, where were we? So I like this pylon on the left hand side. It kind of gets in the way of the hills in the distance, but I don't mind that because it adds a bit of, you guessed it, human nature. So yeah, that'll do. I'm not too sure on the colour of yellow of the house on the right hand side, but it's there, so what you're going to do. And then it's just a case really of working out where I want to be for the properties that are dotted about on the landscape. But there's only so far that I can walk up and down the road to manoeuvre those, and I think from here kind of looks all right. You'll be shocked to hear that I'm at a focal length of 40mm. Kind of like here, getting these yellow flowers just in the corner of the frame. f8, ISO 320, 50th of a second, and I've got my polarizer on, which is helping a touch just bring out the greens and the yellows, but not a huge amount because the sun is pretty much behind us rather than to the side of us, so not getting max polarization. I have had an idea that I want to act on quickly, which is to shoot at 50mm and compare the Sony and the Leica files, which is something I haven't done to date, and that might be interesting in a place that I think looks absolutely up my street for photos. Try and get a similar composition, even though obviously I'm a bit tighter. That's the Sony. And that's the Leica. Pretty hard to tell on the back of a screen, so we'll have to wait till we get home. Ooh, yeah. The sun might be about to arrive. I've got Rich on cloud duty looking that way because I couldn't possibly look both ways. It's working well. Would you like a job? You getting bitten? Well, that's about the extent that the sun came out for the rest of that sunset, and I think it turned out quite nicely. It's pretty much exactly what I had in mind when I found this location on Google Street View. Now, as far as the Leica Sony comparison, I can't see a difference, if I'm being completely honest. Now, the Leica does run a little bit hotter when it comes to white balance, but apart from that, they basically look the same, and perhaps it would be a little bit different if I was dealing with things like skin tones, but for things like this, yeah, I really can't tell a difference. Might be something to do with the fact that I'm using the Voigtlander 50mm Apo lens, which I imagine is more on the neutral end of the spectrum when it comes to the kinds of lenses people are going to be using with M-mount cameras in terms of rendering. Yeah, it's pretty neutral, as is the Sony stuff, so no massive surprise. At one point I was going to call this video something along the lines of Leica versus Sony files, but given that I can't see a difference, I don't think I can do that. So what I thought we could do instead is I thought I could run through perhaps this image and talk about how I have edited it. This is pretty much as simple as it gets. in terms of my photo edits. I've not used any filters, I've not done any masking, I've done nothing with the sky. All I've done is push sliders around. In fact, I've not even done that. I just clicked a preset and tweaked a couple of bits. So yeah, I thought we could run through that start to finish in case you're interested, because I get lots of questions about things like colour in my edits. So yeah. Now, as with all photo edits, this won't be to everyone's tastes, but even if this image isn't to your taste, hopefully you learn something from this slider pushing. So this was the image that I took, and this is the image that we've ended up with. Now, I always tweak white balance and exposure first. They're the only adjustments that I don't touch in my preset pack, because I think they should be adjusted individually for each image before a preset is applied. And as you can see, I've brought the exposure down half a stop, and I've tweaked the temperature as well. I think I shot this with a white balance set to daylight, and I've just made it a touch warmer because it was a nice warm evening and I wanted it to feel like that. Next up, I have taken down the highlights and brought up the shadows. I do that to make most scenes look a bit more realistic. Typically, you can see more shadow detail with your eyes than you can in a raw file out of the box. And it's the same with your highlights. Now, of course, that depends on your exposure that you've taken the photo with, but assuming your exposure has been broadly right, in my experience, you need to up the shadows and bring down the highlights to make it look a little bit more like how your eye has seen the scene. In this case, I've brought up the blacks just a touch as well, just to bring some detail out of the very darkest shadows. Then next up, texture I've taken down just a tiny bit. Clarity I've taken down a touch more than that. I despise clarity, so that's -15. If we boost that up, you can see just how disgusting it looks. Yeah. And dehaze is currently set to -3. That'll depend on the image as well, but yeah, I don't like using dehaze too much either. I mean, there are times it's worthwhile, but for the most part, I don't like using dehaze. Vibrance, I've boosted up to +25, and saturation I've taken down -24. Now, the reason I would boost vibrance and take saturation down if you're new to these tools is that vibrance is a much more selective tool than saturation. Saturation will just boost the colour of all the colours, regardless of how strong they are to start with. Vibrance will take the most muted tones and only boost those. And so in theory, by using vibrance, if you want to make your image a bit more colourful, you should be protected from making the boldest colours too bold, because they won't be touched by vibrance in the same way that they would be by the saturation slider. Okay, so that's that. Now, by boosting the shadows and the blacks, we do remove some of the contrast from the image. And I like to add that back with the tone curves. So if I turn the tone curves off, you can see that what we end up with is quite a flat looking file. So we want to reintroduce some of the contrast here, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So these tone curves look basically the same for most of my presets. So I bring up the blacks just to give a slightly more cinematic look, and I stick a point somewhere between the midtones and the highlights and just raise that a touch, like so. The red channel has just got a pretty standard S-curve, same for the green channel, same for the blue channel. And they do all differ slightly, but that's dependent on each image. So the presets look like this, and then I'll go in and tweak them as I think is necessary. Now, the HSL and color module is where this image really comes to life, because if I turn that off, this is what we get, and then I've changed it to this. So what's happening here? In hue, I've basically warmed up the oranges and the yellows. And then in saturation, I've boosted the yellow a lot, but taken away the vast majority of the green. I love scenes with loads and loads of green, but I don't actually like too much green as a colour. I just think it looks a bit ugly a lot of the time, so I like to strip out a lot of the saturation of the green and just replace it with lots of yellow. Again, not to everybody's taste, but this is how I get the look that I get. And then with luminance, again, I'm boosting the luminance of the yellow. This will depend on things like your exposure and your scene, but for this particular shot, I think that looks pretty good. And then pretty much universally with all my images, I take the luminance of the green that I've desaturated way down as well, because that's another way to introduce more contrast that's been taken away with boosting the shadows and the blacks. And this way, when you've got a scene that's dominated by green, you can introduce some more contrast, but only where the green is. And I find that it just helps other stuff, including the yellow, stand out a lot more. Now, here is one of the most subtle but important bits of the edit for this image. In color grading, if I turn this off, what you might notice, and it's subtle, so you do need to look closely, all the shadows have gone a little bit cold. So if I turn it back on, you can see they've gone a touch warmer. Just look down here in this portion of the image. If I turn it off, a bit cold, turn it back on, warmer. Cold, warmer. And I want these shadows to be warm because, as I said, nice warm late May sunset. So very simple adjustment. All I've done is I've gone to the shadows and just warmed those up a touch. You can see if I take this way too far, it starts to look stupid quite quickly. But if I bring it down to something like this, it just does the job of warming up the shadows as I wish. Sharpening. As you can see, I've gone way too hard with the sharpening actually. I don't know why that's a 135, that's a bit much. But let's bring it down to 100, which is still pretty strong, but not too strong because I've used the masking. Now if you don't know what masking is, let's turn that off. And if I just click on the arrow and at the same time hold the option button on a Mac, not entirely sure what it is on a PC, but if I drag this masking slider along like so, basically all the areas in black are no longer being sharpened. And I'm going to drag it across until all the areas of the image that don't really need that much sharpening are black. So for instance, we got this render in the house, and in these fields as well really, there's no detail there, so we don't need sharpening applied. And if we take the masking off, you can see that these fields just get, I don't know, grainy almost, and it just looks a bit silly. Same with the render here. So if we add the masking back, then what this should mean is that sharpening only ends up being applied to the edges of things rather than every single pixel. So something like that looks pretty good. Profile corrections, this will be interesting because I shot this at 50mm on a 24-70, so I don't imagine there's a huge impact with profile corrections, but turn it off. Bit more distortion than I thought actually. Not that you can really notice in an image like this, but enough to make it worthwhile adding. And then finally, I just add a little bit of grain to my images. I like grain. What can I say? Not everybody does, but I think it just adds a touch of personality to the edit. Yeah, so that in short is how I edit some of my photos. If you're interested, this was Washed Orange 2.0 with some tweaks with the white balance and some other bits and bobs, but that is the preset that's closest to this particular edit. And you can find my presets on my website, my Squarespace website. So thank you very much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. As usual, when I do a trip like this, I have added a page to my website where I've included some of my favourite photos from this trip, so go and check that out. And I think Squarespace is the best place to get a website as a portfolio or a blog for your photography, or an online store for that matter, if you yourself are interested in selling things like presets, books, prints, that kind of thing. Squarespace is absolutely fantastic. And you don't need to know any code, nothing technical. All you need to do is sign up, pick a template from the lots of templates they've got that suit photography websites, and then you can start dragging in your images, playing around with the font sizes, colours, all that kind of stuff. Very straightforward, and yet it's very easy to make your website look professional. So yeah, I think a website is a crucial tool in a photographer's toolkit, and I would highly recommend getting your own. So to check out Squarespace with a free trial, just go to squarespace.com, and after that, if you'd like to make a purchase, just go to squarespace.com/James, and you'll get 10% off of that first purchase. Just notice that the microphone is in my frame. That's not supposed to happen. If you ever wondered, that's where the microphone is, up there. Oh, and this light's not on. Usually I have that light on top of my monitor. Anyway, hopefully that was useful. I'll see you next week. For those of you who don't know, this is Rich, by the way. Hello. Yeah. Nasty piece of work, to be honest, but his work's great, so check him out.